In a world of glimmer and glamour, life is not always free, and there is always a subtle hidden cost attached to it. Firstly, what does globalization of Asian singers or of Asian music look like? For example, firstly, it looks like the inclusion of English phrases into Korean songs. It looks like K-pop manufacturers trying all their best in order to cater to Western likes and dislikes, as a byproduct, creating inaccurate portrayals of content. It looks like Western style fashion and dance moves being introduced into routines that were otherwise more traditional. So my first argument is about why this globalization of Asian music dilutes their culture, right? Firstly, it generates inaccurate portrayal. Why? Two reasons. Firstly, nuances are lost. In K-pop music, there are certain lyrics or certain nuances, certain jokes that are being made that aren't able to be carried, that English isn't able to capture because it does not have the necessary it did not have the necessary history to come back with it, right? For example, the words like short, I can't use an Asian word, but Schadenfreude does not actually exist in English, but might capture something in German, meaning, I like to see someone else fall down in life or whatever, right? But for example, these nuances cannot be, but these nuances cannot be captured in English because there are certain words in Korean, Japanese, or Vietnamese, or whatever that aren't translatable, and this leads to inaccurate portrayal. Secondly, agencies want to be profitable, right? They want to cater to an audience that wants specific depictions of things. Like some of the more harmful things are like, thin bodies or a cute voice or they have this submissive feel to them, right? And we think that this creates pressure within the agencies, some sort of game theory layer where they think that this is what Western audiences want. And so they will push, and so with globalization, they push Asian culture into adapting to these narrow scopes of portrayals. Later. Yeah, sure.
What's the difference between globalization and immense popularity?
Okay. I think with immense globalization is oftentimes the transfer of information from one end to the other. I think that's the most relevant bit in our case, right? And so when we have globalization versus, let's say, trend, you incorporate more Western style thinking into Asian style dances or Asian style music, right? And I think that's mainly the difference. Whilst the trend is sort of just someone doing it and it gets forever lost in time, but with globalization, it sticks. And so why is this sort of better on our side, right? I think with no globalization, no agencies, and less focus on the profit incentive that's generated on opposition bench, we think that our musicians are able to explore their own music more originally, more creatively, according to what their culture demands, right? And what this means is that this leads to a better representation of my own culture. Why? Because individuality is better explored when the agencies have less power on what choice of music that I want to create, right? Like for example, the difference between Japan and Korea, right? I think in Korea, the agencies are far more powerful than the ones in Japan. But in Japan, you see a whole host, the culture is still very much alive because a whole host of power is given to the musicians that would otherwise not have existed in Korea, where music is more standardized to the mainstream, right? And I think, why is this important? So why do we need diversity? Why do we need representation? Why is our culture important at the end of the day? And I think we want a portrayal in the global world, but we prefer at the end to either have no portrayal or incorrect portrayal. Why? Because stereotypes stick. When people all over the world consume your music, first impressions stick to the backs of their minds, right? Koreans must fit a certain body type, and Westerners believe that, this is how it is, right? And so this creates sort of unnecessary pressure on Asian music and Asian people, right? The stereotypes stick. For example, another one is Asian men or having this gentle, mature, loving feel when you watch K-dramas here and there, right? And this led to a lot of vulnerable women from other Asian countries being vulnerable and thinking that all Korean men are like this, getting exploited because they don't actually see the truth of what it is, and they think it's all just glamour and K-pop, right? And I think this also sort of dilutes the women's concerns in those kinds of areas by perpetuating sort of harmful, inaccurate portrayals of stereotypes. So I think opposition bench is primarily going to be arguing about, a globalized world will lead to perhaps better economic outcomes or whatever, right? And I think firstly, the economy can be growing in other ways, right? I think you have lots of industries where Asian countries can go into. But I think uniquely, the harm on our side is that once you have the stereotypes in, it's irreversible, right? The stereotypes stick forever, right? You can't change a stereotype that's been there, right? And I think these harms, and so future generations that come in and try to reverse these harms, it's incredibly difficult because it's already into the minds of people, and so they have a certain expectation or pressure to keep it to keep it there, right? No, thank you. And I think another key stakeholder in this debate, perhaps that opposition might want to highlight is people who generally want to explore the culture, right? Perhaps without globalization, people who want to explore Korean, Japanese, Asian culture would not have as much accessibility to these things. But we tell you that there are alternatives that are just far healthier, right? Going to the country itself to actually experience what it is to be in that country, watching documentaries that are far more objective to what the truth actually looks like, I think are far more accurate portrayals of the culture and is a far better instrument for which Asian culture should be portrayed to everyone else. I think for all these reasons, I'm proud to propose. Thank you.
Not to speak about speech, you want to be a leader of opposition,
Three things. First, on the accuracy of music. Secondly, on the value of exporting Asian culture. And thirdly, on exploitation. Let's start off with the accuracy of music. Their claim is their set of reasons for why the music moves in a good direction that accurately represents people. But this depends on whether or not you believe that as time progresses, the evolution manifests in a good way rather than a poor way. There are several reasons was left unresponded to for why it happens poorly. The first is at the race to the bottom for industries to make the most appealing content possible. And the reason why this is important is because the ways in which they craft the content or place certain restrictions on the artist is in certain ways which prevent that artistic creativity and the full extent of the expression that would have otherwise occurred. The second reason for this is that Western consumers generally have more power post facto of the globalization, for the reason that at the initiation of when this globalization happened, most people in the West tended to consume entertainment more. It was already something that was normalized within society, and this was a market that was predominantly new. So this is that even if people within India or within South Korea were also like people that will consume the content, there was an expectation from the music industry that, well, those people will consume our content anyways. So no matter how we necessarily change the direction of the content, that's least important, because they would still be content with some Korean artists representing them rather than no Korean representing them, as opposed to the Western consumers, where if you don't have some Western elements, they'll never listen to it, which is why this becomes more of an exclusive thing they have to fight for. So the Western space is where they have more power, in addition to the types of just greater purchasing power from the West. There's quantitatively more people when you open up access to foreign markets. This is similar to how the male gaze was the primary market to cater to when you portray women sexuality, because you had to do so in a way that necessarily appealed to those people because they were a larger market. But thirdly, even if there's a premium of authenticity and political correctness, this assumes that people know what is authentic and what is politically correct. Like if you want to have backlash against a company, you need to know that you're portraying things wrongly, and you need to know what is an otherwise correct interpretation of that. But they give very little reasons for why that's the case. We outlined from first that the reason why they can't make this assessment is because the forms of content they were exposed to were already those that were not politically correct, were already those that had tainted stereotypes to begin with. And thus, if all they were ever exposed to was this tainted version, they would never be able to hold these companies accountable, and those industries have predominant power to shape what you expect out of them. What is the actual impact of this? The first is that each time someone from the culture interacts with a piece of this content that is inaccurate and does not represent their interest, they feel like this music industry has failed, if they feel like they don't actually have something they relate to, or in cases where people have a more antagonistic view of the West, where they view the West as colonizers, where they view this type of music as being colonial against them, they have active forms of resistance against wanting to accept this type of music, which obviously is bad, because if you believe that you're a vulnerable group of people you have to care about, then obviously we ought to maximize their representation in a way that satisfies them, rather than having representation for the sake of representation. But secondly, the problem with this is that the artists who would otherwise create more original, authentic, and accurate content are now shifting their focus towards creating more globalized Western content, because there's an expectation on the industry that if you don't do this, you'll falter, you'll fall behind. And thus the people who would otherwise want to create good content are now not doing so anymore. So this actually reduces the type of choice that people have, because there's a finite number of artists, there's a finite number of time and money you can put into creating these labels. So the money that would otherwise go into the good ones are now going to the bad ones. So that explains why it hurts accuracy and why accuracy is important. The second thing I want to question is the value of exporting Asian culture. Opening opposition is a bit peculiar. They say if we have more cultural interaction, it increases understanding, and maybe some people, have access to partners of a different race. Well, I don't know, man. Like, I just don't agree with this. I think the types of people who will want to care for you are probably still going to do that. But aside from that, I think the groups of people who are genuinely interested in learning about authentic Asian culture will do so regardless. They'll still visit museums. They'll still tour these types of countries. They'll listen to songs and watch documentaries that were in the original language, and they'll make an effort to do so. And the reason why this is true is because, as opening opposition themselves concede, they opt into the trends because they are curious about things that are a little bit different. And so it's unclear why you have to make them predominantly Western in order to get them to care. And to understand why this is true, you have to look at why Asian music became popular. Because a few of those songs became viral at the initiation point, and people realized that, hey, actually there's not something so bad about K-pop. There are some actually interesting elements in there. They have catchy tunes and so on. And thus people flock to those markets, and then those industries at the top realize, hey, actually the Western markets are pretty lucrative. And as a result, they'll push more of the Asian artists into making those Western elements. But what we would instead prefer at the regrets point of this debate is that we would regret the point where those industries ever moved in that direction, but the original reasons for why people demanded those things still exist, because that's not part of the globalization, right? People still find content they find interesting, they still find it interesting. So there's no reason why people listen and appreciate, and this is the second point I'll make, that there's oftentimes criticizing of these artists when they try to be original, when they try to be more closer to the culture, because they see this as not as interesting anymore. So this increasingly pressures the artist to cater towards the Western gaze instead. But the final question I want to ask is the export of culture and the economic growth of the Asian music industry an intrinsically valuable thing? They are weighing it's just a shallow one-liner on. At least they get money. But the money doesn't trickle down to the people, right? The ones who profit are the agencies and record labels who own the exclusive rights to those music and the artists. What's the implication of this? My argument is that the industry isn't representative on both sides anyway. The least you can do is ensure that the culture isn't tainted by the forces of Western demand. Because if you're not going to make money out of it, the last lifeline you have is at least make it represent you. So this is the type of thing we protect. On the other side, the money doesn't go to you, the culture doesn't represent you. This is just a face that doesn't actually represent what Asian music is about. See you.
First year at Manchester is good without population.
Yeah, I think it would be excellent. Because I would have believed that I could have found that without actually selling it towards the Western audience. That's the difference here. The reason why Western audiences necessarily make it worse is because you have to change the way that night would have been portrayed. Finally, from PM, we already weighed why less exposure is preferable to more exposure if more exposure is done badly, because those stereotypes stick, they're irreversible and difficult to overcome. The third thing I want to talk about is exploitation. It's no secret that K-pop is one of the most exploitative industries in the entertainment world, and idols undergo extended periods of isolation. They have to be at the back and call of the agency's demands when they cater towards beauty standards. There are claims that, well, this happens symmetrically. So yes, there are other factors for why agencies in the industries will be exploitative. But this is the most significant of those factors, because it activates the capitalist incentive to churn out as much music as humanly possible and to perfect it in a very specific way that showcases the most sanitized versions in order to be the most appealing in a saturated and competitive space. The reason foreign markets uniquely activate this is because industries realize the lucrativeness of this now, and they otherwise shift the direction that would have cared about the people. This argument is important because they assume that more economic growth is a good thing, but if it activates harmful incentives for how they treat artists, the very people who are putting their lives out there for you to talk about your music are the ones being harmed. We ought to regret that. This makes music worse and more exploitative for those reasons proposed. Looks so good. Is this recording?
Yeah.
Oh. Depending on how I go, I have to. Okay, sorry. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Panel, I genuinely really love listening to Japanese music. I love listening to Do, to Unravel from Tokyo Ghoul, to When I Circulated from Rent a Girlfriend. This sounds very low impact, but it actually had such a significant impact on my life and the way I perceive my identity and things in the world. A few things I'm going to do. I'm just going to respond to the kind of claims that we hear at opening government and why our case is more important. The first thing I want to know here is that I think there's just like different music ideology that you get from these like kind of Western norms. And I'll explain what this looks like, for example, later in my speech. But for example, in Japan, for example, it's quite common to have things like anonymous singers, which you don't really typically get as much in Western music culture. The second thing here is, I think there are also different narratives that you hear throughout this music. For example, like the kind of narratives that you hear out of like a lot of Asian music, for example, is like the kind of norms about like work culture or love culture that is quite often like uniquely distinct to their kind of society and the way they see things in the world. Again, I'll explain this and flesh this out a bit more further in the screen. I think the impact that to all of the mechanisms that kind of goes at racial is quite important because just representation on its own is something that you should rate really, really highly in the state. I'm an Asian Australian. I've lived in Australia my whole life, so I don't really have that kind of physical connection to my homeland. However, when I experience something like Asian music that I genuinely feel invested to, that I genuinely feel like I have a connection to my homeland, that I think that I really value as part of my core identity. If I was like a Korean or Japanese person living in Korea and Japan for my whole life, I would also be really happy just to see the fact that my culture gets to be portrayed and gets to be like appreciated throughout the rest of the world, especially considering the fact that for the past like 100, 200 years, all we have had in terms of international cultural export is stuff that you get out of the United States. And I've often consumed like media that comes out of the United States as a norm in my life. I also think there were genuine hard impacts that I think like OG tries to play upon and tries to weigh in their kind of case. But I don't think it stands because I think there's a few problems with the premise. The first thing is that I think that the fact that you just implicitly get higher engagement with Asian music on our side, we do implicitly get high engagement with Asian popular culture and Asian culture in general. The reason this is important is because you are probably more likely to engage with a community that you feel welcome to. When you're invested in something so much, like you listen to Japanese music on the tube every single day, that is something that you like start to develop as part of like your cultural identity. That means you start going to see bands that play this kind of music. That means you go to see conventions and you start becoming part of a community. There are economic flow-on effects to this, especially to the underrepresented artists that we seem to care about in this debate. The fact that they can suddenly get an additional source of revenue, considering that both sides of the house agree that it's symmetric, that in the country of origin, that you kind of get the economic benefit. I think there is an additional, even if marginal, there is still an additional benefit for having like royalties and international payments. Think about things like anime, for example. Crunchyroll is a massive anime distributor. That is economic flow-on benefits that usually goes down to these companies to incentivize them to keep producing things, to take on new projects, which are often just like fiscally very risky because you never know whether something is going to succeed, such as taking on or signing on a new band, for example. The second thing is, I just also think this like represents these underrepresented artists because I think it's also just like kind of stupid to say that all of these artists care about money. That's not true. They care about having their music heard. They care about having people listen to it. And what better way to do that to show it to an audience that they could never have imagined could just consume this music. And this is really good. The third reason I think this is really important is because it just challenges these kind of Western cultural hegemonic norms that you kind of hear at radio. This includes the tokenistic stuff that you get out of Western music in America. Americans still dominate all international music exports. They use this to propagate the kind of American norms around things like freedom, things like individualism. But even when the US music attempts to be culturally inclusive, it often does this in a very American-centric way. For example, a lot of American rap music often revolves around things like African-American things. But I have never heard anything about things like African people living in, say, Japan who have grown up in that country. There's this really good Japanese artist called McCreadie who is like a black person living in Japan who, through her music, is able to reflect both sides of her identity because she's got this really powerful voice that just shows that she's not afraid to be timid and doesn't feel like she has to be constrained. And I guess the typical Japanese idea of like what you should be as a person being. But she's also able to sing that in Japanese and be like legitimately
genuine, authentic representation of her cultural identity. The weighing on this is pretty simple. Firstly, the fact that I have a stronger sense of identity as a person, that is the most proximate impact to me as a person, as someone who lives in an Asian country or person of an Asian diaspora in a Western country. That is also the most proximate impact to me as an artist, because I get to visibly see people consuming my content. Secondly, I think the fact that you get high international exposure for Western countries is great. You develop more cultural empathy and understanding between your countries. You like acknowledge like some other cultures' validity. You have open-mindedness between the cultures. You're probably more likely to at least be open or even support ideals, values, norms, and policies which support these groups. I want to know that, like, for example, if you go to like any anime convention, a lot of the time you'll have things like Japanese ambassadors going there because it is a form of cultural soft power. This is a way they can say they can interact with these communities, and this is just a great combat to the fact that Western cultural colonization has literally occurred. This impacts the way people literally see the world. I want to just know on accuracy and dilution. I think this is a confusing thing because has American popular culture been diluted by the fact that they export it massively to the entire world? I just also want to know that when they say, oh, nuances are lost, oh, lyrics in English that are lyrics are like that are in like foreign language are things that like English can't capture. I just don't understand this because when I listen to Japanese music, I don't understand the Japanese in it. Like this is a Western construction and the idea. I listen to J-pop because of the cause, because of like the story of the artist, because of like where it descends on, because I just enjoy the fact that they have such a passionate voice. The response to dilution is that firstly, it's not necessarily true, as I explained. Secondly, I think you're just more likely to hammer down on success when you see a culturally successful product. I think this is a unique subculture that eventually develops generally. I'll take the POI from closing. I think Koreans ought to be proud for all of its flaws, for all of the issues that we do have to concede on both sides of the house. I think Koreans are generally very proud of the fact that BTS is getting so popular. The fact that there are Australian members in BTS, and then I can have my sister at school sing that and being like, oh my God, that is an Australian up there in my Korean band. That is a genuinely amazing fact. The fact that somebody, or say a minority, or somebody who's previously felt underrepresented can see themselves there is just the most amazing thing. The second thing is I'm also just willing to make this trade-off, even if you believe it. Because the thing is, I think that the extent to which Western culture or Western ideas are probably more effective is on a greater extent than the way that like Asian culture has to adapt to this. In terms of the music, I think you get far more change on our side of the house than you do, on the Western side of the place than the Asian side of the world. I just think that, like, at the end of the day, you're probably going to get more Western cultural change than you are to get Asian cultural change, even if you buy that. I want to talk about exploitation and economy now, because this is also a very weird thing. Surely, if you have increased globalization, that means you have increased global scrutiny, i.e., increased Western scrutiny from Western consumers who do know about things like labor laws and significantly prioritize them in the way they see the world. This means there is probably more attention to the fact that we're debating the Korean music industry because we know about that. And as consumers, we can make purchasing decisions based on that. And I think this is really important because this is, at the end of the day, the only way we'll ever be able to affect change in this society, which has probably been very resistant today. Also, final thing, I think sex is really good and the other thing that's great. So far to post.
I just want to trigger warning in my speech. I'm going to be discussing eating disorders, so I'll give everybody a couple seconds if they want to leave the room. If not, I'll bring my speech. A couple seconds. Starting in 3, 2, 1. My case is going to be very simple. Why it contributes to harmful stereotypes, and we're going to actually go into the case of like why this leads to exploitative. I think we're going to be very easily take over our opening here. And we're also going to mitigate a lot of what we get from the opposition, but also flip what they get. Let's respond to CEO's like POI really quickly and just bustle about this Malaysian society existing. I think, yes, you can argue that there will be some extra representation just globally, but it's unlikely to be that this representation is actually good, and it's actually likely to contribute even harmful. And there might even be people, members of that society, that may fetishize the Asian people for the reasons that they have contributed and consumed and internalized this media. Therefore, this is likely to be, yes, we can concede there will be more representation. There's no guarantee that it's going to be good. It's actually more likely to be bad, hence why we win this K. Then let's see on OO and how they're talking about exporting cultures like Asian immigrants and how this helps with your identity. This, like, I think it's very fair to say that like Blackpink or BTS aren't typically representative of what Korean people are like. I think it's a very stylized, very perfected, very strictly marketed idea of what these people look like, and therefore it's unlikely to be a very accurate representation of what Korean culture actually looks like. This is likely to be internalized as like a skewed perception of what being Korean looks like. But also, if I see like Asian stereotypes being projected through music that I suffer with through school, my new community, etc., I'm now more likely to reject this music and by extension this part of my identity because others are consuming it and projecting these stereotypes even further. Therefore, my perception of myself as an Asian is likely worse on their side of the house because it reduces mental health outcomes and the ability to self-actualize and align yourself with this identity. Thus, the interaction with this culture is either likely one, wrong, two, openly rejected, but also there is like some internalization of a more vulnerable actor, which is like how Koreans who live in Korea are also likely to internalize this. They're also likely to feel that BTS is an accurate representation of themselves and it's probably contributing to harmful stereotypes of like men being effeminate, for example. And so this is likely to actually lead to like more open rejection and thus more like self-hatred or just hatred generally internally within these cultures. And this is likely to lead to several harms. Let me run into my case and like why is harmful stereotypes. We're going to extend upon our opening. What does this globalization of music actually look like? We're going to be the only team that engage with the fact that this is retroactively done, how this actually came to be, and hence why we're going to make us logically prior to our opening. Originally, this music was produced by like Koreans for Koreans by Indians for Indians. It was generally produced by like producers, for example, in Gangnam, for example, which means that they were speaking about their experiences in Korean to a Korean audience. What happened over time, and I think this is what we take over our opening, this music got picked up by Western audiences who reductively named it K-pop, for example, but then a handful of bands get swept up into the fame. But what does this look like? It looked like a reaching a point of global fame, but not only was it that like Korean producers weren't even benefiting anymore, BTS was now picked up by a Western producer and therefore was able to be capitalized there because they got a better contract. And what this means is that the benefits that we get from this success actually don't actualize because this is likely temporary if you get it at all, because these Western producers are going to pick up these bands. But this means that you're no longer being controlled or guided by Korean producers as well. What does this mean? When you have an increase in Western audiences and Western producers, the cultural purity of the music is that gets diluted down, e.g. BTS, Vivo or Blackpink Afro music. I think what does this dilution of the music actually look like? We're going to mechanize further than our opening. It looks like, first of all, speaking in English, whether this be the hook, the chorus, or the entire songs, that are still going to have to be the appeal of being in a Korean/Indian artist without the appeal of like Western audiences. Now it's more appealing, it's more palatable because I can understand it and it's more likely to engage with it. Two, there's less songs about what it means that are like culturally relevant or / inspired by their own country. And two, more generally broad themes of like love or hate, for example, which are no longer applicable to the experience of being Korean or the experience of being Indian. This is all like because the music can be like pushed into the Western mainstream, not just niche audiences. I think a lot of what Top Up assumes is like Western audiences engage with this very particularly. I think what they're talking about are the niche superfan audiences. We're talking about how this is getting pushed into a Western mainstream and how this like harm actually proliferates even further on our side of the house. And so I think that's where the real harm comes in. They also say reducing yourself to be more palatable, for example, by Western audience like a boy band type, or aligning themselves with existing stereotypes, e.g. like Asian women being infantilized because they understand that that's something that people can engage with because the Western audiences are familiar with it. Why is this so harmful? Because the cultural soft power that government talks about is significantly mitigated, first of all, but two, it portrays a skewed version of what being Indian/Korean music is to the global audiences. And what does this look like? And this is how we weigh out over our OG. It looks like harmful stereotypes being perpetuated by what the West are now solidified, because not only is it just that like Western audiences may have perpetuated this onto Asian people, but now Asian people are actually perpetuating stereotypes in and of themselves. And this makes it more likely to like for people to buy into the stereotypes, whether or not they're Asian or non-Asian. And this is incredibly harmful for people's psyche, but also the Asian experience generally, especially in foreign countries. So this means that like artists start belonging to like stereotypes and perpetuate it further. But also the music is no longer serving the domestic artists and consumers that harms their experience of art. And we're going to be actually mechanized art, guys. Why is this? The language is different. It has less meaning. I don't entirely understand the cultural affiliation because it is in different language. I don't understand it as a Korean person if I don't speak English. There's less about Indian or specific experiences, for example, love or politics. Therefore, I have less an affiliation to it because it doesn't hit my proximate psyche as to my experience within my own country. Music is now Western and follows Western chord progressions, for example, rather than like the triads that you find in Bollywood music. Therefore, I find it like less just sonically appealing, but also it just means that I feel affinity for it less because it does not no longer relate to my culture. Therefore, consumers don't experience their own culture as well. Why is this important? It's important for mental health, how you interact with your culture, all the reasons that we get from opening opposition about like how we interact with our identity and how we interact with our culture through experience, through the way we experience art and how it has significant impacts on our mental health outcomes are all skewed and damaged on their side of the house. But also, I think you get like authentic Bollywood artists that do not westernize their own music, probably have no avenues for actually getting success in their side of the house. Because investors do not see this as a worthy investment to invest in them or sign them on a contract, because if they refuse to appeal to Western audiences, you're either seeing like all of the Bollywood music or all of the K-pop music are probably westernizing themselves to try and get success, and therefore you get no cultural proliferation that is diverse. Oh yeah, sorry. Yeah, there's a problem with this case because the American like culture is also the biggest consumer of the American culture. When it comes to like K-pop and indie music, the biggest consumers of them become the Western audience. None of that really stands, because it doesn't mean you have to morph to the other audience, because it's the same audience. That case doesn't really stand, guys. But alas, I think you want to talk about how these people just won't see any success. They'll be crowded out by these westernized like music participants, but it also basically means like worsening perception of Asian cultures and people, and generally just reduced cultural experience in their own country. So there are harms on multiple fronts. But further, the periphery countries that are forced to mold to this new formula, for example, Bangladeshi music now has to form to like Indian Bollywood music, or Chinese and Japanese music now have to form to K-pop music, because of the stereotypes and the associations people make with these races or these groups or regions. The same way that like Bangladeshi restaurants now have to serve Indian food because of the affinity towards it, you're going to see that a secondary impact is unlocked in CG, because now you see a greater amount of harm. Let's go further though. Given that you see so much media success in the formula and the government and all the reasons of opening opposition talks about, you can see that this is likely to lead to, as far as possible, exploitation of young people. This is like exploiting young children to be molded from a young age to become teenage girls or to be in a girl band. This happened with Blackpink, where the girls were selected from as young as 13 and were, 1, criticized over their body, their skin, their hair, etc. This is like plastic surgery. This is like eating disorders. 2, taken out of school, reducing their avenues for other success. 3, literally working 14 to 16 hours a day to push out music and choreography. 4, heavily scrutinized by other industries in their dating habits, their addictions, etc., because the government relies on them so much for success. Why is this important? 1, they're vulnerable people. Well, I guess Nikhil do the rest.
I've got some general gov bench rebuttal, some framing, and then 3 cases. 1 on the quality of art, 2 on Asians who are not currently living in Asia, and 3, why globalization is so important, unlocking the actual narrative of this debate, which is specifically about globalization. Because panel, recognize the actual words used in this debate. It is not a trend, it is not a temporary upsurge, it is the globalization. This means the infiltration of this sort of music in non-Asian spaces for a permanent set of time, and a general normalization of it because it is now globalized and in these and proliferating within these spaces. That means it is not a temporary trend for us to hop on. They invite a certain level of normalization for us to contend with. This looks like Spotify recommendations as you open up your applications. This is like the proliferation of YouTube videos and clips from Bollywood films on TikTok, stuff that I engage with on a day-to-day basis and that I recognize. Some general rebuttal then on the government bench. 1, we think fetishization happens anyway because a lot of this fetishization narrative happens within the countries themselves. It is often the people within those countries guiding those fetishized narratives that are then played on within those countries. And 2, we think you still have the capacity to listen to independent artists who you want to listen to in that sort of way from your country. We're talking specifically about how this impacts specific people in the globalized countries, not the people from within those own countries, because they still have the capacity to listen to independent, authentic artists, as you want to say. We're only specifically talking about the step towards integration that we get necessarily on our side of the house. And 2, we think that people liked the cultural properties of these of this music, because if they didn't, the minute that it starts westernizing to a certain extent, at that point I just start listening to Western music. It is the specific intrinsic cultural properties that link to their nations, that link to the stuff that is cultural to them, that they can not only engage with and learn about, that they actually care about, that they actually enjoy, because it is specific and necessary to that culture and is authentic to that culture. That's one of the reasons why people enjoy these things. Otherwise, they would just engage with Western media anyway. 1 then, why do we get better quality of art? We think generally these Asian countries tend to have less socially accepted and generally more regressive social stigmas as compared to the West. For example, India is known for being relatively more regressive for women's rights than countries in the West. How does this change when the globalization of music happens specifically in the West? One, not only do I need to interact with progressive issues to gain a voice on the social market, because it's not like I can go off presenting these regressive views. I'm now able to somewhat access some sort of more social progression, which then also then goes back to proliferate in my own home country. But two, because you have to target a bigger audience, you're going to be less beholden to state restrictions telling you that you need to have these regressive narratives within your work. This means that, and finally, third reason is I have to make necessarily good art because I'm now competing with a lot more other cultural music, because I'm having to now compete with like Western music, but also like coming from like general other countries and general other Asian countries, which means I then also have to like make sure I'm making generally good art and generally good music for us to enjoy. Moving on to my second argument, and this is the main thing that we bring to you on CO and the primary stakeholder in this debate, which is Asians who are not currently living in Asia, the isolation that they feel, and how this necessary globalization unlocks their own ability to feel included, represented, and happy in their own Western countries. And this comes from a very personal perspective, because I have a lot of friends from these countries, and I think this globalization has done nothing but help them. Two generations. Why this helps first generation and second generation. First generation immigrants who have left their home and who now have moved to Western countries to live in. One, not only have they left their own home country and their own culture and have to adapt to a significantly different country, especially socially compared to what I've considering what I've said earlier. But not only do I feel isolated because the Western world is so different to my own world and because the culture is so different, when this music gets globalized, this looks like things like Odeon now showing Bollywood films because there's a proliferation of music in those areas. It looks like people now talking about these musics around me. Not only does this make me feel more included and more part of the community, but I now have some sort of connection to my home. This only happens with globalization, not with the trend that government wants to have you believe is the case. It happens with globalization, because with globalization comes the normalization. That is when I'm able to actually have access to these things and not feel stigmatized on them. But also second generation. Now I'm able to connect to my culture. When I am from two homes and I feel like I'm not part of any of them, now when this globalized music comes into my area and that I actually have the capacity to listen to it now means that I feel more included in my area and I don't have to pick between being either English or Indian. Now I have the capacity to listen to this music in my own hometown. Not only does this generational difference between these two parties now get smaller, because now we're able to listen to our own music from our culture, which means that Asian people in like more Western countries can now actually speak to their parents about this music and speak to them about it and have more communication of it. But crucially, when this sort of music gets globalized, it gets normalized within society. So now I do not feel stigmatized for liking this music. When I tell my friends that I like Bollywood music, they now don't give me a face and tell me that I'm silly and oh, what's that? That's so strange. It's not a trend. It is now something that's globalized, something that people generally talk about and accept. Now I feel validated for liking the things from my own home culture because they are more normalized around me. This insecurity is necessarily what we're able to resolve on our side of the house, because now people actually feel accepted within their spaces. I'll take a POI from
Yeah, so this assumes that people are going to be actively represented by the culture, but the only big culture that the Westerners have access to is the sanitized version of it. They'll still judge you when you kind of.
We are speaking specifically not about white people engaging with this music, but Asian people engaging with this music. When this Asian music exists in these white spaces, that is only then that white people actually get involved and appreciated by it. They stop looking down on Asians in these countries for enjoying this sort of music because it is now normalized in my spaces and there is actual discourse about it. Okay, moving on then about why globalization is so relevant and why we get better interpersonal relationships. So one, not only do you get better interpersonal dialogue because you now have at least some delta level of cultural interaction between these spaces, but because globalization is happening on such a massive scale, we're talking about thousands of people going to these K-pop concerts, millions of views and streams on Bollywood music. People cannot divert to prejudices because they actually have friends who enjoy this music now, which means they can't scrutinize as much as they used to. At least now, or at least like they have non-white friends who enjoy this music within their schools, but also not only that Asian people feel less ashamed to like this sort of music and therefore feel validated and better about it, but it also means there's now integration into Western society about addressing that these cultures actually exist and your Western culture is not the only dominant thing that exists. Now that it is globalized, I recognize there are other cultures that are not my own. We remove this Western dominance that is constantly perpetuated through society. This is like PSA, especially when it's young people interacting with these on social media. It now looks like having more PSHE lessons that address these generals, that address that these other cultures exist and that is not only your values that are validated. This looks like having a conversation with my white parents about this other Asian music that I talk about that they then talk to their friends about. We get better quality of art. We get more representation, and better dialogue. For all these reasons, proud to vote.
When you go to Hounslow in London or Little India in New York and go to an Indian restaurant, most of the time it's not an Indian running that restaurant. It is a Bangladeshi or a Nepali person that is forced to run that restaurant because their culture has been mainstreamed as a result of things like globalization. We think this is the most harmful impact in this debate because it is not something that they benefit off of. Even if we concede that opposition bench is entirely right and you get all the benefits of money and fame and soft power and things of this sort, notice that Bangladeshis don't get these benefits when they try to mainstream into Bollywood, or Nepali people don't get the same set of benefits. It's the most harmful impact in this debate. And I think this is how we win this debate. But first, I want to deal with the money clash, because I think this is something that opening government actually fails to address and can be quite harmful to their case. The first thing that I want to point out is that we just outweigh this on the whole. I think the first thing to point out is the amount of harassment that you're faced with is just simply not worth it. This looks like kids in schools being picked up and forced into like K-pop organizations for training at a very young age. But also I want to point out that there's like a shit ton of media attention around these sort of things, right? That is to say, every single action of every single kid that gets picked up by these media, by these like K-pop organizations to become the next BTS or the next Blackpink or whatever, face immense amounts of scrutiny over every single action they do in every single day. And this probably looks like even breakups and things of this sort, which just means that you have direct mental health impacts. But also I want to point out that the weighing on this is very simple. Even if you have a shit ton of money and you have a terrible, life because people are constantly criticizing the things that you do, it doesn't mean that you have a good quality of life. The simple intuition pump here is that celebrities sometimes tend to be the unhappiest people just because they often are always on the radar for all of their actions, but also because money just doesn't buy you happiness in that sense, right? At the point at which you literally live through hell every single day, have to undergo things like plastic surgeries, have to make sure you stay in some sort, in some shape and things of this sort, just so that you can cater to these industries, I think your life is probably pretty bad. And this is further exacerbated at the point at which this is affecting vulnerable teens and kids. I think again, the simple intuition pump is, I think there is a large number of celebrity suicides and things of this sort. Money really can't do too much in that sense. But second, on soft power, I think Aimee already tells you that this is extremely short-lived, right? That is to say that we probably mitigate this because I think at the point at which BTS keeps diluting their music to cater to the Western market, you probably lose that bargaining chip in the first place. Because at the point at which you don't really cater or you don't really have the originality of Korean music, I think you eventually just lose the whole point of soft power anyway. I think we probably mitigate this in that sense. But last, I also think you don't actually represent the interests or the culture of the people. So you're probably not welcome at home either. At the point at which you concede to globalization and have to change your ways so you can cater to a Western market and get the supposed benefits that you get on off bench, I think your home population also probably doesn't respect you. And this directly clashes with closing opposition because they say that you get more listeners or whatever domestically, but presumably without the globalization, this happens anyway. And to a greater extent, I'm unclear as to why this happens on closing opposition. But second, notice on things like tourism, right? I think the people that people in these countries probably don't welcome you because you have these harmful stereotypes that both government teams talk about, but also because you're influenced by these ideas of these fetishized ideas of finding my Indian baddie or Korean wife and things of this sort. I think generally you're just probably unwelcome in these areas because you're not going there with a good interpretation of what their culture is really like. It's just generally a bad thing on that level. But also notice that a lot of the money doesn't even benefit the population. I think we take this a step further than our opening because they say that agencies probably take away most of the money. But look, at the point at which you have globalizations, it's not just domestic agencies, it's agencies from abroad. But beyond this, let's take this another step further. I think at the point at which you have your culture being integrated into another one, i.e. if I'm Bangladeshi and I'm forced to feed into like Bollywood mainstream culture, I don't benefit off of anything because I'm still competing with them while being forced to erode my own culture to get some benefits in the potential future. This is an entirely speculative benefit that doesn't accrue, but you get all the harms anyway because you erode your own culture, you don't get the mainstream attention, things of this sort. But you also face things like harassment from the media and like these organizations that pick you up and harass teenagers, things of this sort. I just generally think you punish vulnerable communities when you do this. Let's deal with opening opposition then, because I think they have a few like major problems. First, on Asian stereotypes, like in combated in this industry, I think one, they literally just say that the industry can combat stereotypes. They don't explain why you're likely to do it. But second, I want to point out that there is no point in claiming backlash creates an incentive to stop stereotypes. Notice that they just say this. Here's why you probably don't do it in the first place. I think one, your industry leads the world. You have a large number of fans. You have no reason to be like, oh, there are human rights violations in keeping a kid in work 13 hours a day when you know that they're going to be the next biggest star. But second, there's fucking Western backlash for fucking everything, man. Like, you're not going to get any result out of anything. Like the West is free to criticize literally everything in the world. If you see that you have a benefit in like having a kid that is in a particular organization that has potential, you're not going to give a shit about this. But second, the scale on vulnerable population. I think when Bollywood thrives, Bangladesh is still affected. You don't get the benefits. This forces men into stereotypes, forces the abandonment of their own culture. But last, on catharsis, I think this is the same. You can have this without globalization. You can see people from your own culture on the global stage without globalization and still enjoy it. But second, I think you probably flip this, because if there are people from your culture that like give in to globalization and now no longer like actually represent your culture, why the fuck are you getting catharsis? They're not representing your culture. If anything, they perpetuate stereotypes. You're not going to get the benefits that opening opposition talk about. I think that's the flip on them. Before I move on, opening. Closing.
My bad thinking is
No, but like it doesn't. I don't know actually. I don't know what the point of this question is. Cool. Opening government. I think first, like the on the point of content race to the bottom. I think this is partially true, but I think Aimee takes this to a second level because they don't respond to the backlash claim that comes out of opening opposition. We do, which makes that claim reliant on our response. Because without the backlash response, you cannot have like any sort of content, like cannot succeed in the content race to the bottom. Second, on exploitation, I think Aimee takes it a step further by telling you why vulnerable individuals, and particularly teenagers, are the most affected when they are no longer able to do things like go to school, live a normal life, and are forced to be like followed by the media every single day, are forced to give up their lives and cater to things like the industry. But also, they have to follow like these disgusting standards of like, I don't know, getting like surgeries and things of this sort just so that they can live in the industry. But third, I think we take this a step further when we tell you that the domestic industry probably supports you, but at the point at which you have globalization, you probably lose all of this money anyway. I think Bollywood has such a profound impact on countries like Pakistan who are forced to abandon singing in Urdu, for example, and sing more in Indian Hindi and things of this sort, which just means that they're generally forced to adopt these sort of ideas. I think the proxy impact is bad on multiple levels because even if you buy O's push, I think it's just generally bad that you have to abandon your own culture for no like gain or speculative gain at some point in the future. But it's also just principally unjust because you are literally suffering as a consequence of another country's success. You get no benefit. I think the vulnerable actors in this is how we win this debate because we have multiple reasons as to why like kids are the ones that suffer. But also last, I think on dealing with CG, I think first of all, we don't really buy the whole like push on exposure because we don't think this exposure is good in the first place at the point at which you probably like don't like the people from your own country who go on and globalize. But secondarily, I think the vulnerable actors are the people we ought to care about in this movement. For all those reasons, closing down.
I mean that laptop is recording. Yeah. Okay. I'm not a bad Indian because my Hindi isn't great or because I'm queer. Closing opposition will win this debate on the ability to connect to cultures you feel distance from are a lot more reasonable than the claims on exploitation that are coming out of government that rely on really extreme characterizations of how these industries look. I'll rebut closing government and I'll explain why we win on 3 metrics. On closing government, there's 2 premises in this case I want to make. The first is that this media gets co-opted and appropriated by Western actors. 2 responses. Firstly, this is just off clash. I think the entire debate agrees that what matters is the Asians that don't live in Asia and their experiences. See the literal clash on top of specifically in the characterization. But beyond this is inherently unpersuasive because there's a pretty substantial collective mass of actors, and musicians and Asians that have immigrated out, that backlash and call out their friends if you internalize this. And this is empirically true because 2 years ago, there were massive boycotts of Bollywood actors and musicians who advertised skin-bleaching products and the ability to feel Western. If this is done so badly as both gov teams claim, we get the recourse and closing opposition because we get the collective mass beyond just the Indian countries, beyond just Korea, where they can succumb to this and claim that we don't want to do anything about this for fear of backlash from the West, for fear of looking inferior to the West. And then the big premise on closing government is that you get this homogenization of culture. Silvia flips this. I want to flip this in 2 more ways. Firstly, the appetite for these nuances does not get revealed in the West until you see them in the mainstream. The intuition pump here is simple. Did you really think there was an incentive to get brown representation in Hollywood in the West until you saw Mindy Kaling, and Mindy Kaling complained in the Western media, until you saw Bollywood actors proliferating into Hollywood and talking about their experiences and people really vibing with the Priyanka Chopra Nick Jonas wedding? No, you needed the awareness and you needed the appetite for these things. These only get realized to investors when you have this globalization. But second flip, which is already in Silvia's speech, completely unresponded to, we explained that competition with the West forces Asian music to delve into themes which they would otherwise not do because it would make them feel uncomfortable. Things like divorce, things like infidelity, things like secularity, things like queerness, things which uniquely lock Asian people out of this colonized perception that they have of their own culture, things that lock Asians out of like bonding with their parents and having boundaries with their first generation immigrant parents, these kinds of things. This is a more granular explanation of why this matters at opening opposition, and we should all just take on the directness and like specificity to music. Thirdly, and just in their best case, we would rather a Bangladeshi person feels like they can at least find some community and support with an Indian, as opposed to having to constantly fight for their identity on their side of the house. They have no recourse, they have no space for these communities to thrive, and they have no appetite or collective mass in the grand sphere. Why does Silvia win? 3 metrics. Firstly, on the quality of art. Again, unresponded to, no thank you, by both gov teams, but I'll flip this premise on the dilution of culture anyways. Here's 3 reasons why you don't just pander to the West at the trade-off of Asian cultures. Firstly, proximity bias. There's a massive social stigma around appeasing a previous colonial power about appeasing the West. And you know this to be true. Think of the way that China interacts with the West. Think of the way that India and all of these kinds of actors are actively trying to distance themselves and make themselves look superior in the West in actual policy. This extends to culture specifically because of the inferiority complexes that both gov teams talk about, specifically in terms of how over generations we've been conditioned to believe that we are inferior and we're trying to overcompensate for this in music. So we say in closing opposition that if it is the case that these artists are diluting and selling themselves out, there is massive backlash that exists within these countries, but for the Asians that live in the West. Secondly, artists, not just Asians, write about content that is thematically incredibly proximate to them. The same way I'm kind of trauma dumping right now in this debate, this is what musicians do to appeal to people in the thing. This is all of the stuff about how art brings catharsis, which CG makes fun of, but it's actually deep. Because if I didn't listen to music by Chapel Roan about queerness, if I didn't listen to Bollywood music specifically talking about the queer experience in Hinduism, I would never have come to the realization that it was okay to be me within the spaces I felt structurally locked out of. But thirdly, because you still need a USP, if the top half clash on corporate incentives actually matters, closing opposition solves this, because if it is the case that Asia is seen as so bad, if Avatar is such a shitty song, it's unclear why you continue with this and don't try and nuance out. Conclusion, there are checks and balances. You obviously want to stick pretty much to your culture. It's pretty arbitrary on government what it means to be authentic. Then flipping DPM. DPM claims the asymmetry of Western power constrains them, but at best this hurts OO and doesn't hurt us, because we show that the spaces still exist for you to be authentic, because you don't lose your local culture, because there's still an appetite that exists in the West in the first place. But even if you don't buy this, we sidestep this burden of Western palatability because we show there's a pretty substantial option for Asians not in Asia to have this kind of true music in the first place. The simple intuition here is that for months and months and months, me and my brown friends in Essex protested for months to try and get Bollywood films into Odeon cinemas. It was only when the appetite was there, when this perceived globalization capitulated, that we were able to get the representation that we wanted. Opening?
You assume the West is exclusively driven. K-pop idols are being given better conditions because redheads and tech people.
My first mechanism response to this to say that K-pop is just one subset of a wide variety of Asian cultures that otherwise appeal to people. We should massively outweigh this in scale. We already disproved the recourse on this. Secondly, and most importantly, on the experience of Asians not in Asia. This is just the lowest burden impact we claim in the debate that is exclusive to globalization, that is exclusive to music specifically, which is opening opposition's paper when they just generalize this to the general oppression that people feel. Firstly, we reach a more aggregate impact on the ability to bond with people that otherwise you wouldn't be able to. So in university, my ability to bond with people that are actually from India, my ability to bond with Azmi, even though we're massively different because we're able to sing Bollywood music and feel okay about ourselves. But secondly, if government is so concerned about the accuracy of representation, all of the extremes I talk about don't have this recourse. But at least in closing opposition, we explain why the shame and insecurity feels better in your individual spaces. You're able to talk to your white friends about it. You're able to invite them to the Bollywood parties to celebrate Bollywood music. You're able to call out the specific inauthenticities and inaccuracies only when you have this globalization, only when there is the appetite for these kinds of things. And this matters the most because this impact aggregates over the largest scale of people in the debate. Because specifically for you to believe any impact on the way people engage with music, you have to believe the authentic actors. We think that Asians are the most authentic representation of Asians. They chat to their white friends, they call out things internally, they live a better life, and that's why CEO wins.